After the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Japan started to conduct a more active foreign policy and has become one of the biggest financial supporters of Ukraine. Japan has also increased its military spending and started to closely cooperate with its allies and partners in East Asia. The country believes that by supporting Ukraine and increasing its security capabilities, it can prevent Russia from achieving its strategic goals in Europe and stop China from starting another war in East Asia at the same time. For decades, Japan relied on the rules-based international order to achieve economic prosperity, and as this order is now under threat of being undermined by hostile powers, the country has no other choice but to do whatever it takes to protect the status quo to ensure its own survival. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, Japan declared the unconditional surrender to the Allied nations, which was formalized on September 2, 1945. As the leading Allied power in the Pacific, the United States assumed control of Japan and appointed the five-star General Douglas MacArthur to administer the country and enact military, political, economic, and social reforms. During that time, the government of Japan, along with its American partners, wrote a new constitution which came into effect in 1947. Article 9 of that constitution states that Japan renounces the use of war as a means of settling international disputes and prohibits the country from maintaining a military for offensive purposes. To protect Japan from any external threats, the country relies on security guarantees from the United States, which has dozens of military bases across Japan. In 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea with the approval of Soviet Union and China and started the Korean War, the American administration of President Harry Truman adopted the containment policy, which was aimed at stopping the spread of communism in the Pacific region. Japan played a crucial part in that policy, as the country was used for the supply and transit of the United Nations forces that were led by the United States and fought alongside South Korea on the Korean Peninsula. Japan also played a crucial part in American efforts to implement the island chain strategy across the Pacific Ocean, which helped the United States maintain its influence in the region. In the north of Japan, the United States had a significant naval presence to counter Soviet influence in the Far East and force Moscow to allocate more resources to East Asia to spread its forces across the two continents. In 1951, Japan signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty with the United States and other allied nations, which ended the formal control of Japan by the United States. The treaty also required Japan to pay reparations as part of post-war settlements to China, the Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, Myanmar, and others. During that time, Japan also adopted the so-called Yoshida Doctrine, named after its Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, which focused on economic recovery and development. It emphasized Japan's reliance on the United States for security and allowed Japan to concentrate on rebuilding its economy under the protection of the US military umbrella. One of the central pillars of the doctrine was the promotion of an export-led growth model. As a maritime nation that had a lack of raw materials and energy resources, Japan began to heavily rely on sea trade to sustain its economic model. Thanks to the ability of the United States to guarantee the freedom of navigation across the globe, Japan started to import energy resources such as oil from the Middle East to support its industrial base, which was focused on producing high-value added products such as vehicles, electronics, and machinery, and exporting them primarily to the United States. By adopting such an economic model, Japan was able to fully rebuild itself and become the second biggest economy in the matter of decades. In the 1970s, Japan experienced a series of geopolitical shocks that affected its foreign policy. After the relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated as a result of the border conflict, the American administration of President Richard Nixon managed to normalize relations with Beijing in 1972 and later opened its market to the Chinese goods. Japan was initially concerned about Nixon's decision, as it was unsure what role it would play in East Asia if the strategic priorities and commitments of the United States in the region shifted. At that time, Japan decided that it would be in its best interest to follow in the American footsteps and engage with China diplomatically and economically as well. That is why in 1972, Japan and China signed the joint communique that affirmed the commitment of both countries to peaceful coexistence and cooperation. While the normalization of relations with China helped Japan achieve its geopolitical objectives at that time, despite the initial concerns, another geopolitical shock was just around the corner. In 1973, the armed forces of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel, which started the Arab-Israeli War. After the United States responded to the war by supplying weapons and other equipment to Israel, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries in retaliation imposed an oil embargo on the Western countries. The embargo had a material effect on Japan, since it led to the increased cost of energy imports, resulted in slower economic growth, and highlighted the country's vulnerability to external energy supply disruptions. Japan understood very well at that time that it needed to take its energy security more seriously so that it could sustain its economic model. Since Japan was prohibited from using force to secure energy resources, it began to expand its energy trade with other regions. It has also increased the imports of natural gas and coal and accelerated the development of nuclear power as a domestic energy source to mitigate the impact of future oil supply disruptions. By doing so, Japan decreased its reliance on a single supplier and was able to resolve its economic issues at that time. Japan also understood that it needed to conduct a more active foreign policy and not rely solely on the United States to secure its interests. That understanding helped the country to better prepare for the upcoming challenges that were just around the corner. In 1975, the United States has fully withdrawn its forces from Vietnam and exited the Indochina region. Such a decision has raised concerns in Japan as it had broader implications for regional security and Japan's interests. The country responded to the American decision by playing a more active and independent role in regional affairs. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Takeo Fukuda, Japan has adopted the so-called Fukuda Doctrine, which aimed to promote economic integration and cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. At that time, Japan began to invest in countries that are part of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to strengthen the bilateral ties and minimize the risk of a potential conflict in the region. The United States still played an important role in protecting Japan from the Soviet threat, but Japan's more active role in regional affairs helped the country to conduct a more independent foreign policy, which was required of the country in the following decades.
Good evening, and Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more.
The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 has completely changed Japan's security environment. The lack of a major adversary led to a period of strategic uncertainty for Japan. During that time, the country continued to promote the policy of peaceful coexistence and started to establish relations with former Soviet countries and former members of the Warsaw Pact. In December of 1991, Japan recognized the independence of Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries and established diplomatic relations with them. In 1993, Japan signed the Joint Declaration with Russia, which outlined principles for resolving the long-standing territorial dispute over the Northern Territories, which are legally a part of Japan but have been occupied since 1945, first by the Soviet Union and later by the Russian Federation. Throughout the following decades, Japan's main foreign policy objective was to promote regional stability and economic prosperity, while it played an important role in maintaining global peace with all the other responsible actors. It wasn't enough to deter the bad actors from using force to try and achieve their geopolitical goals.
ロシアによるウクライナ侵略は断じて許されません。我々はウクライナの人々を積極的に支援します。世界の平和と秩序を守る正念場です。世界の人々と連帯し、日本も役割を果たしていく必要があります。
The Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has shaken up the Japanese society to its core. Japan long ago renounced the use of war as a means of settling international disputes, and Russia's decision to invade Ukraine has gone against the Japanese way of life. That is why it's not a surprise that right now over 90% of Japanese citizens hold negative feelings towards Russia. One of the first things that Japan did right after the invasion was to impose personal and trade sanctions against Russian Russian officials and Russian businesses. Later, in one of his speeches that was given a couple of months after the invasion, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida stated that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. From Japan's point of view, the Russian invasion is creating a precedent for any nation to defy international law and achieve goals with the use of force. Considering Japan's close proximity to Russia, it makes sense for the government of Japan to believe that the start of another war in East Asia is only a matter of time. In recent years, Russia has started to militarize the northern territories and use strategic bombers and nuclear submarines to conduct military training in the Sea of Okhotsk. Russia's partner China has also intensified its attempts to change the status quo by force, as its Coast Guard vessels have been constantly harassing Japanese ships near the Senkaku Islands, which are Japanese islands that China claims to be its own. Russia and China also began to conduct joint military exercises in the Sea of Japan, and in 2023, Japan has recorded over 100 cases of suspicious naval activity by Russia and China along its coast. North Korea is another threat to Japan's security, since recently it has increased the number of missile tests in the Sea of Japan, started to supply Russia with ammunition, and could participate in joint naval exercises with China and Russia in the future. In the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese Air Force in recent years began to actively violate the Taiwanese airspace, while its navy and the army simulated the simultaneous blockade and airstrike of the island to prepare for the future invasion. In the South China Sea, Beijing has built artificial islands to claim the territorial waters of other nations, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, and it has also intensified the harassment of Filipino fishing boats in the territorial waters of the Philippines. In the Indian Ocean, Beijing signed a new defense cooperation agreement with the Maldives, which made it possible for China to send its navy to patrol the territorial waters of the Maldives. In the Middle East, Russia's partner Iran has been disrupting shipping routes that go through the Strait of Hormuz by seizing container ships to stoke tensions in the region. For Japan, all of those developments create an existential crisis due to the country's continued reliance on extremely volatile ship lanes that support its economic model. As of today, Japan imports 97% of the oil that it uses, while oil itself accounts for 39% of the country's total energy supply. The country's biggest suppliers of oil are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. Considering that Japan's adversaries have the option of disrupting the country's oil trade, Japan's energy security is currently at risk. The same thing could be said about Japan's food security, since almost 60% of its food consumption is composed of imported foods. Japan relies mostly on the United States and China for food imports, and while its trade with the United States is unlikely to be significantly affected anytime soon, the reliance on China creates another set of risks for the country as tensions continue to rise.
Stronghold stance and military actions present unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge, not only to the peace and security of Japan, but to the peace and stability of international community at large.
From Japan's perspective, the best way to prevent a war in East Asia is to make the cost of war for the other side too high to even consider it in the first place, since China, Russia, and other hostile powers are now militarizing their societies. The cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in late 2022 approved a new national security strategy that proposes a significant expansion of Japan's military capabilities and a major increase in military spending in the next 5 years. Japan has already started the militarization of its islands, began to acquire anti-ship and missile systems, and became the biggest foreign buyer of American F-35 fighter jets. Japan has also started to play a more active role in American integrated deterrence strategy that resembles the island chain strategy, which aims to increase the cooperation between the American partners and allies in the Pacific region. In recent years, Japan has been working on improving its relations with South Korea, and in 2023, Japan, South Korea, and the United States for the first time in history conducted joint military training at sea and in the air in the Sea of Japan. In the South China Sea, Japan joined Australia, the Philippines, and the United States to conduct joint patrols in the region that are expected to become permanent in the future. At the same time, during the meeting between Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden last month, Japan and the United States signed new military agreements and agreed to develop a new air missile defense network to protect both countries from the Chinese hypersonic missiles. To strengthen its defense capabilities even more, Japan is also looking to become a part of the AUKUS alliance that consists of Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. At the same time, it began to scale investments in various projects in the countries that are part of the Asian Union to build mutually beneficial relationships and retain the status quo in the region for as long as possible. Japan also believes that the failure of Russia to achieve its strategic goals in Ukraine is also one of the best ways to ensure peace in East Asia, as it will discourage China or any other hostile power from starting a war in the region. That is why Japan in the last 2 years has become one of the biggest financial supporters of Ukraine, as it already provided and pledged to provide Ukraine a total of $12 billion in economic aid so far. While Japan did not provide any weapons due to its pacifist constitution, it provided generators and other power supplies for the Ukrainian people in response to Russia's attacks against the civilian energy infrastructure. Japan has also transferred 5 gas turbine generators and announced the plan to deliver 7 transformers to support energy provision for over 5 million Ukrainians. Then last year, when the Chinese General Secretary Xi Jinping visited Moscow to meet with Putin, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida traveled to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky to assure him and the Ukrainian people of Japan's unwavering support of Ukraine. In December of 2023, Japan shipped missiles for Patriot anti-aircraft systems to the United States so that Washington could deliver those missiles to Ukraine. At the beginning of 2024, when the United States Congress was debating whether to continue the support of Ukraine, Japan announced additional financial aid to ensure Ukraine's macroeconomic stability, while its foreign minister visited Kyiv to discuss the potential Japanese security guarantees for Ukraine. In February, Japan hosted the conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine and signed dozens of agreements on cooperation at the governmental and private sector levels. In April, Prime Minister Kishida gave a speech to the United States Congress in which he stated the importance of passing the American economic and military aid to Ukraine that the Republican Speaker Mike Johnson had blocked for months. Thanks to its proactive foreign policy in the last 2 years, Japan has become one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. Japan's government understands that preventing Russia achieve its strategic goals in Ukraine and improving its own military at the same time is one of the best investments in Japan's security, as it could stop other hostile powers from starting wars in other places and undermining the current rules-based international order, thanks to which Japan was able to rebuild itself after 1945. That is why Japan is likely to continue to support Ukraine for years to come, as the result of the war in Ukraine will determine Japan's future as well.